Hello everyone, this is the Casual Fan. Today we are going to preview the Australian Grand Prix and then provide our predictions at the end. The Australian Grand Prix is going to be the third race of the season. The first two races, well, they were fun. We had Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc battling against each other in Bahrain before anything that can go wrong with Max's car went wrong, which led to his retirement and a Charles Leclerc win. In the second race of the season in Saudi Arabia, we had another battle between the two drivers, but this time it was Max Verstappen that won the race with Charles Leclerc coming home in second. Looking at the other parts of the grid, we have Mercedes struggling to catch up to the frontrunners while Haas and Kevin Magnussen are enjoying a resurgence in Formula 1. The midfield battle is intense, while teams like McLaren and Aston Martin have messed up big time and find themselves floundering down the pecking order. All in all, the 2022 season, at least until now, has been a bag of surprises and excitement, and there are certainly indications that the rest of the season is going to continue in the same vein. Having said that, and after recapping what we have seen until now, let's jump straight to the preview of the Australian Grand Prix. Now in the preview, first of all, let's take a look at the pecking order that seems apparent after the first two races of the season. Now in terms of the pecking order, the 10 teams on the grid are divided in 4 groups at the moment. The first group is the backmarkers. In the backmarkers group, we have Williams and Aston Martin firmly placed in that group. After the first two races, it has become apparent that these two teams are the slowest and the second slowest teams on the grid, with Aston Martin being just marginally quicker than Williams. Neither of the teams have scored points in the first two races, and it will be interesting to see how their season develops from the Australian Grand Prix onwards. The second group is the midfield group, and it has a highly competitive cluster of as many as 5 teams in it. There's the resurgent teams like Haas and Alfa Romeo that are benefiting from a turnaround this season. Then there are the usual suspects in Alpine and AlphaTauri, and in the end we have a slightly disappointed McLaren that is somewhat underperforming this season. There isn't much of a gap to choose from these teams, and the track layout and the conditions are more or less determining which team will hold the advantage. Having said that, Alpine is currently leading the standings for this group before the Australian Grand Prix. The winner for the best of the rest will be determined from this battle, and looking at how close these teams are to each other, it is anybody's guess who is going to nick the advantage and finish a prestigious 4th in the championship this season. Now the third group, well, we have only a single team in this group, and this was the name coined by none other than Toto Wolff while reflecting the plight of the German team. Mercedes finds itself in a no man's land right now. It is clearly not in the league of Ferrari and Red Bull. There is a clear difference in performance levels for Mercedes as compared to the other two teams. On the other hand, Mercedes is clearly a step above the midfield. The ease with which Hamilton was able to carve his way through the field during the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix was a clear evidence of the advantage Mercedes has over the midfield. Sure, Mercedes will be desperate to catch the front two teams and will be aiming to close the gap in the Australian Grand Prix, but for now, Mercedes finds itself in a no man's land where it is clearly slower than the front two teams and clearly quicker than the midfield group. And well, now finally at the front, well, there is no prize for guessing. We have the duo of Ferrari and Red Bull. They have fought for pole and the win in both the races and are expected to do the same in the Australian Grand Prix as well. There's not much to choose between the two in terms of overall pace, as both appear to hold an advantage of around half a second per lap over Mercedes, at least until now. Now, with the pecking order out of the way, let's take a look at some of the key storylines for the Australian Grand Prix. The new track layout and the 4 DRS zones will bring a sense of intrigue into the race. Before the changes were made, Albert Albert Park was more of a well balanced track with a bit of something for everyone. Now the track is much faster. The slower sections are limited to a small section after turn 2 in sector 1 and the finishing sequence in sector 3. To add to this, having 4 DRS zones but only 2 detection points throws a curveball on how drivers might approach racing. To be fair, it's hard to determine what exactly will be the impact of having such a huge section of the track aided by DRS, and we will need to see what happens in either a 2-car battle or when a chain of cars approach the DRS zones. For now, well, according to the poll that I had on Twitter, even the F1 fans are not entirely on board with 4 DRS zones in the Australian Grand Prix. The Mercedes contingent, well, if we are honest, it has talked a lot in 2022. It started the season with the talk of Lewis proclaiming that his team never makes mistakes. Toto Wolff was laying the foundation of a strong response after what the team had to endure at the end of the 2021 season. And even after the first race, there were confident claims of Mercedes bouncing back soon and closing the gap. Well, we've reached the Australian Grand Prix now, and the clock is ticking for the German team. It's clear as day that Mercedes is not in the same league as Red Bull and Ferrari. However, despite knowing that, the Australian Grand Prix has to be the race where Mercedes starts to show that it can cut down the deficit to the teams at the front. Hamilton and Russell are already more than 20 points behind Leclerc, and this gap is only going to increase until Mercedes is at par with Ferrari and Red Bull. Australian Grand Prix has to be the race where you see the first statement of intent from Mercedes, because if that's not the case, then the team can kiss goodbye to the hopes of fighting for either of the titles. Now moving on from Mercedes to the more feel-good moment of the Australian Grand Prix, we have Sebastian Vettel making a return to Formula 1 this weekend. The German had missed the first 2 races of the season due to COVID, but will be making a return at the Australian Grand Prix. Now, while there is certainly a feel-good element to Vettel coming back, it will be very intriguing to see what the German is able to achieve at the Australian Grand Prix. The Aston Martin is just not a good car this season and is certainly a downgrade from what Vettel had last season. While the German will be happy to get back to racing in the Australian Grand Prix, it will be interesting to see what he can achieve with the 9th fastest car on the grid. Now, when we look at the form guide, sure, Red Bull won the race in Saudi Arabia, but it's hard to say that Ferrari is not the form team right now. The Italian squad has maximized whatever results it can get and not make too many mistakes. It bagged a 1-2 finish in Bahrain, and then when it moved to Saudi Arabia, despite losing a win to Max Verstappen, it did pick up a 2-3 finish in the end. That's 4 podiums in 2 races and an advantage of 41 points at the top of the leaderboard. Mattia Binotto recently came out and said that the team was much better prepared to fight for the title this season than in 2018 when the team, well, it imploded. Whether that's the case or not is something we'll find out later in the season, but for now, the Italian team appears to have got off to a great start to the season. Now let's take a look at which team is out of form at the moment. The 2021 season was a massive disappointment for Aston Martin. The team finished a distant 7th in the standings. Even then, Vettel had made 2 trips to the podium last season, once in Baku and the second one in Hungary, which was taken away from the team later. Contrast that to the 2021 season. Aston Martin is in a massive hole right now. The car can't buy a Q3 slot if it had to, and talking about a points finish seems to be a bit of a long shot right now. On pace, Aston Martin is the 9th fastest car on the grid right now, and you have to question what the hell have they been doing all this while. Mercedes' struggles with its car have somewhat taken the focus of the fact that even the other Mercedes teams are struggling immensely this season. With Vettel coming back in this race, we might see the focus shift to Aston Martin and what it is able to do on the track. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's jump to the fun part. Let's jump straight to the predictions for the Australian Grand Prix. Now, unlike the Saudi Arabian GP, which had flat out sections almost throughout the lap, the track for the Australian Grand Prix, well, even the modified one, is more balanced with some slow speed sections leading to the fast speed ones. Ferrari and Red Bull were very close to each other in Saudi Arabia, and it can be said that the layout favored the Red Bull machinery more than the Ferrari. During the Australian Grand Prix, we feel that the Ferrari will be a match for Red Bull in the fast speed sections, but can pull away in the slow speed sections of the track, and because of this, we are leaning towards Charles Leclerc to win the Australian Grand Prix after another close battle with Max Verstappen. Now, Haas had a rather average outing in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. The team raced with just one driver as Mick Schumacher crashed himself out of contention in qualifying. Magnussen scored points, but it wasn't as impressive an outing as Haas had at Bahrain. To an extent, the circuit layout in Jeddah played to Alpine's strengths as it was able to overhaul Haas in terms of performance. However, in the Australian Grand Prix, expect Haas to be back at the top of the midfield once again, as Albert Park is probably, well, it's not as extreme a layout as Jeddah was. Considering everything that is going on at Mercedes, it has to be said that George Russell has been very impressive this season. He was more or less on the pace of Lewis Hamilton in Bahrain, and in Saudi Arabia he ended up going for the better setup. He was more or less on the pace of Lewis Hamilton in Bahrain, and in Saudi Arabia he ended up going for the better setup, and while Lewis stumbled in the race, George was able to be the flag bearer for the team and finished 5th in the race. The young British driver has something to him that makes him undeniable on the F1 grid, and we might see him beating Lewis Hamilton again this weekend. Well, Aston Martin has stayed below the radar and its underperformance has not caught the eye of the fans and pundits alike. However, by the end of the second race at Jeddah, it is getting more and more identified that the 2022 Aston Martin Challenger is not competitive at all. The car hasn't had a hope of reaching Q3 in the first two races, and points have been a distant dream. For the Australian Grand Prix, expect more of the same from Aston Martin as the team struggles to get to terms with the new regulations. Now, Nicholas Latifi is slowly but steadily catching the attention of the F1 fans. Sadly though, not in a good way. Latifi was thoroughly outclassed by Russell during their time together at Williams, but that was looked at as the brilliance of Russell more than Latifi just being an average pay driver. However, this season, with Alex Albon teaming up with Latifi and meting out the same treatment to the Canadian, the opinions are starting to change. It didn't help either that Latifi crashed out in both qualifying and the race in Saudi Arabia. For the Australian Grand Prix, there's not going to be much of a change either, as Latifi, well, he just does not have a very high ceiling as a driver, and he is going to disappoint yet again. So with this, we conclude the preview and predictions for the Australian Grand Prix. I hope you guys liked the video. Please like, share and subscribe to the channel. Have a good race and see you next time.